So if you're like me, you're wondering, is choline the secret to what they call anti-aging, or to put it another way, epigenetic reverse aging? Let's explore that. It makes perfect sense to me, and I think the answer is yes, but a few caveats. The deficiency of the last 70 years has a lot to do with it. And this is the deficiency of the last 70 years. And it's a complete game changer to overall health, and specifically to anti-aging, if you add this in to your diet. All right, questions to answer are, what is anti-aging in a nutshell? Can it be affected by nutrition? How can it be addressed? And why is choline such a big deal? What are the biggest obstacles to achieving reverse aging? Seriously, what are they? It's dietary deficiencies and medications that prevent uptake of vital nutrients, and that's with every medication, whether it's aspirin or antidepressants or name your favorite medication. Along with the idea that in the United States anyways, at the age of 55, the average male is on 5 medications. Wow. And the third part is genomic vulnerabilities that make them have a greater need for certain nutrients than other people. This creates incredible harm when the nutrient deficiencies aren't met for these people. So 4 questions you need to know the answers to. Why is choline so important? What's its functions? And the consequences of choline deficiency. The second, how do we become so deficient over the last 70 years? Is it due to diet, medications? Third, who needs it most? What happens to those most vulnerable when they become deficient? Fourth, what are the best food sources? All right, why is choline so important? What are its functions and consequences of deficiency? I'm going to compress 150 years of science and what we know about choline into about 15 seconds, okay? Maybe a little longer. Okay, it actually was referred to as the mother substance of all, not the mother of all substances, the mother substance of all, and here's why. In 1850, lecithin was identified and given the Greek name of lecithin from their Greek word of egg yolks. Pretty interesting, coming up, by the way. 1862, lecithin from bile was heated and it generated choline. 65, choline discovered abundant in the brain from human autopsies. Lecithin was identified as phosphatidylcholine. Okay, now they got the molecular structure and everything else. So the big surprise was, wait a minute, choline is like really a lot in the liver and in bile. The liver makes bile and it makes a lot of lecithin, phosphatidylcholine. And it's also choline's in the brain. Now when you go back to, let's say 2,500 years ago, at the time of Hippocrates, when he said, let food be your medicine, among other things, they would identify, the way they looked at health then was about being too much phlegm, too much bile. And so bile was a big deal. And they talked about bile in the brain, you know, and the phlegm and so on and so forth. And so here we are, 2,500 years later, acknowledging what they already knew, which was choline, bile. So whether you want to call it bile in the brain or bile in the liver, it's in both places. Pretty interesting, huh? So in 54 is discovered how choline was made into phosphatidylcholine in humans. And in 1960, there's a second pathway that goes through a very key gene we're going to talk about today for choline into phosphatidylcholine. And choline was identified as part of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So suddenly this thing is like, wow, this is actually pretty important. We got to pay attention to this. Though it wasn't created into a nutrient until 1998. So in 1930s, it showed that choline prevented fatty liver in dogs and rats at the University of Toronto. So Best and Banting, 5 years previous to this discovery, they had isolated and discovered insulin and then started giving insulin to type 1 diabetics and changed the world. So this is pretty dramatic. They did 2 things in a row. Okay, and from 2005 to 22, pretty much the world of genetic orientation, looking at SNPs, looking at genomic mutations, has really become what they call precision medicine. How do we become so deficient over the last 70 years? Is it due to diet, medications? I have no idea. Do you? Overnutrition, a culture of hyperpalatable food to keep you eating, It's composed of high omega-6 fats, high carbs, nutrition deficient, like the Doritos syndrome, additive impregnated food. Processed foods are full of highly engineered additives. It's not just little salt and pepper. Food companies are, in essence, putting drugs into your food. And the correct name for this is food additive addiction, or refined food addiction. Let's pretend that we are all exactly the same genetically. So you or I are the same person, right? We don't have a mutation difference between us, which of course is not true, but that would mean that we are dependent on our diet and our ability to make choline, since we just learned about that, right? So what would that look like? Well, first off, 70% of the choline that we need on a daily basis for all those functions, we'll get into later, but for muscle, for nerve, for brain, for bone, for immune system, 70% of the choline comes from our diet. But our diet didn't look so good, did it? We assume people are average, so this is us, which is just a bell curve. So if you eat more stuff, you'll get more choline. Yeah, you gotta eat the right stuff for sure, but that it's a bell curve and that we're all pretty much the same. But there are people that differ in nutrient requirements and responses. So some are metabolically efficient, genetically metabolically efficient, and others are metabolically inefficient. They have a lot of mutations. So we're pretending that you and I are the same, that we are both metabolically efficient. But there's a whole category, a whole population of people that need more nutrients because of these genes have become partial obstructions. They've slowed down the process. They've required more nutrients. So the reality is 90% of people in the United States and probably the rest of the world are deficient in choline by a lot. Okay, now we're getting into it. But 30% of our choline requirement, remember we have no mutations, we have no problems, you and I are identical, we make 30% of what we need. Absolutely, make 30% of what we need. So we're never completely down to zero, we're down to 30% on a bad day. And it goes through primarily this gene up here, PEMT. We saw that before. This is what we make endogenously to phosphatidylcholine and then on to all these other things. Okay, the reality is that 50% of people have little or no ability to produce choline. So there's a lot of people in that other little bell curve that need a lot more choline because they can't make it or make it very, very little of it for themselves due to genomic mutations, SNPs. Populations differ in distributions of SNPs throughout the world. Sort of saying the obvious, but that's why we have this. That's why we're not genetically the same. And we do differ by a lot of these mutations that we have. And in terms of biology, to be fair, there's a lot of workarounds. Nothing's a straight path. There's never a complete obstacle, but there's other different paths around it that may not be as efficient as the straight-on path. Okay, we inherited them from our ancestors, it goes without saying. All right, who needs most of the choline? Most of us are deficient, so we all need some. And many of us are metabolically impaired. These are the most vulnerable who will experience all of the problems from choline deficiency. So they will have dementia, they will have various forms of neurological issues, they will have weak muscle mass, they will have a compromised immune system, and so on and so forth. When deprived of dietary choline, 77% of men and 80% of postmenopausal women develop fatty liver, just like those dogs up at the University of Toronto, and muscle damage. So basically it's the same. Postmenopausal women are just like men, right? Not much difference. Meaning that this population is entirely dependent on their ability to make choline, that 30%. And if they don't have that 30% working for them, they are really in some desperate situations. And I believe that explains a lot for our incredible rise of Alzheimer's, dementia, chronic illnesses of all types. And this is what that looks like. This is simply a smaller piece of a panel that I look at for genomic mutations. And this little box down here, both of these have to do with choline and the need for choline. And so this down here, here's a person who's in a pretty bad shape. He's homozygous, he has it on both genes, and his ability to process that gene is not operable or very, very poor. These are other genes that contribute to that he doesn't have, so it's not a worry, but he has a few other heterozygous up here. So you look at the overall picture, not just one thing. Here's just a couple others. Here's that same guy that I showed you compared to a little boy and his situation. He has some heterozygous problems down here and a lot up there. So this is part of what they call one of the quick, don't want to blind you here, but the methylation system, basically changing things from methionine to homocysteine, and this is where that gene was we talked about, the other genes here. They all contribute to how quickly you can get homocysteine back to methionine, also making things called SAM, which is a methyl donor. But this is what we're looking at. We're going to get to the idea of a balanced, a healthy methylation pattern. And the pattern you want to have is you're not deficient for any of these. So if you're slow in some of these genes, that you're making up with it by a nutritional diet or a nutritionally full diet. And these genes would be of no reason to look at all if our diet was full for everybody, if we had a fully nutritious diet. Okay, here's folate. Here's problems with folate as well, because they go together, as you'll see in a second. B12 and folate. There's a bunch of genes that affect these. Each one has a story, and some stories are just not that good. Only 44% of pre-menopausal women develop fatty liver. So I just said 77%, 80% of postmenopausal women get fatty liver. Roughly half that premenopausal. So what's the difference? So we know it's associated with choline deficiency, but enter estrogen. They obviously have a lot of estrogen. So the estrogen producing peak years are, we're going to keep it simple, between 20 and 50. And so through this period, what we find, and here's just two different graphs of the same thing, it shows that testosterone has not changed that much for women. It's basically all about estrogen rising and falling, and I could have done more. So gallstones typically form between the ages of your estrogen producing years. So why is that? What does gallstones have to do with estrogen? And here's the story. Well, the story is about choline deficiency, but estrogen has the ability to turn on these genes, like the PEMT gene, the PEMT gene, turn it on and really crank it. So it starts making, that 30% makes a lot of choline, right? It makes a lot of choline as best as they possibly can. Really amp it up there. If you have a poorly working PEMT and a few of these others that are estrogen sensitive is the word, they're not going to work very well. So you don't have that ability. So for women that don't have very good PEMT genes, they can't make their phosphatidylcholine, during those high estrogen years, what they're going to be doing is that they're going to be making a bile that is mostly cholesterol. Why is that? Bile should be 90% phosphatidylcholine. If you can't make it and you're not eating enough choline to make the phosphatidylcholine for your bile is going to be mostly cholesterol, and that's a lot thicker and sludgy, and that's what your gallstones are made of. So it's an indirect way of saying these are the women with the genetic problems, and most likely they have a choline deficiency from diet as well as genetic malperformance. Okay, estrogen and gallstones. So the question becomes, is it really about estrogen or about choline deficiency? Or about not being able to produce any choline due to having key genomic mutations? I think you know the answer to that. So briefly, the risk factors for getting gallstones for women is, doctors will say it's 40, fair, fat, and fair. And men get them also, but it speaks to that era of their life of high estrogen and not being able to, and being choline deficient as a combination. So you have 40 or older, actually it's 40 or older, so it's when the estrogen's starting to drop off a little bit, right? You're starting to fall between 40 and the average age of menopause is actually 49. And so they have a genomic predisposition. Native Americans are big with that. Mexicans kind of mixed. Overweight, obese, sedentary, pregnant, high-fat diet, having diabetes, losing weight very quickly, taking medications that contain estrogen. So estrogen tends to increase the cholesterol production as well as supposedly increasing your phosphatidylcholine production. But if you don't have the right genes, you're not doing the lecithin side of things. And so consequently, you get a very sticky, very sludgy, and prone to make these clumps, which are called gallstones, that hang out in your gallbladder. But that's 30% depends on your genes, gender, and age. Compared with men and postmenopausal women, younger women are 2 times less to develop fatty liver and muscle damage due to choline deficiency. So they have that backup. There's that estrogen thing. It's going to push them. So however ineffective it is for these people to make, these women to make choline, lecithin, and then lecithin, they can make more during that period than they can postmenopausally. So they all get less. So it's about choline, not just about estrogen. So high levels of estrogen during pregnancy and breastfeeding ensure a proper choline supply for a growing baby. That's the perfect situation of no mutations and so on. And that is meant to feed the growing baby. The growing baby needs, the fetus needs to have a lot of choline. And so what happens if the mother can't produce it, it is subtracted from her. It is actually mined from her cell membranes and so on and so forth. So the mother has to have enough choline for herself and for her fetus. Same thing happens with things like calcium and so on. They're mined from the bones. So a lot of pregnant women become osteoporotic early on. Okay, choline deficiency and Alzheimer's disease. These are just 4 research titles I put up here to give you an idea that this is a really big deal. This is a really big deal because dementia and Alzheimer's, which is the majority of all dementia cases, is huge and it's very expensive. And so how can they address this? Obviously, the pharmaceutical companies are trying to do their part to make a lot of money on it, and that's become useless. They do not have a successful Alzheimer's or dementia medication. 2019, 3 years ago, common nutrient supplementation may hold answers to combating Alzheimer's disease. That's choline. Another one, choline intake correlates with cognitive performance among elder adults in the United States. Choline and phosphatidylcholine may maintain cognitive performance by multiple mechanisms, neuroprotective effects of choline and other methyl donors. So it's 2019, 2019, 2019, 2021, all very recent. What you need is a balance of choline with folate and B12. The problem is all 3 of these are the most likely things to be nutrient deficient with a poor diet. They're the first to go. That is why folate, folic acid, was added to cereals and so on and so forth decades ago, and B12 is in some foods. Choline is considered now to be added. It's not added to foods yet, but you need these 2 to balance the methylation. Remember that little constellation of all these little things? This is what's needed to balance that. This is to achieve a healthy methylation pattern, which means you can methylate, you can turn genes on and off as you need. That's what methylation's for, to turn genes on and off. A healthy methylation pattern, and how you measure what they call the methylation clock is that they line up all your genes and see which ones are turned on and which ones are turned off, and they have all these patterns. And if you're obviously malnourished or leading a very stressful life, you're going to be aging faster. You're going to have a very unhealthy methylation pattern. All right, what are the best food sources? For choline, folate, and B12. This is on Chronometer. I made a spreadsheet from it, and everything here is 3 ounces. So we're doing an apples to apples by weight comparison. We find the highest source of choline by a lot is egg yolk. Most people have eggs and not egg yolk directly, but if you have a choice, egg yolk is more than twice liver. So if you're having whole eggs and liver then would be your source of choline, just depending how you have your eggs. Cod liver, which I put in here, is a source, but it's not as good a source of egg yolks by any means, and not as good as pork liver or veal liver. And then when you go on to look at B12 and folate, the top sources for that are liver. So we're talking about egg yolks and liver, the 2 foods that most people didn't have over the last 70 years. It's in part why we got to where we are. So the highest concentration is egg yolks. So this is 3 ounces is roughly 5 to 6 egg yolks, by the way. So when people say 5 eggs a day, good. Plus you got your protein. And your B12 is veal liver, and your highest concentration of folate, not folic acid, is turkey liver. Okay, again, so if food is really your medicine, on a per weight basis, egg yolks are nearly twice the amount of choline than pork liver. Huge, nearly twice the amount. I'd consider egg yolks being your medicine. Know your egg yolk colors. Really orange, full of carotenoids and xanthophylls, means the chicks or the hens or the whoever were pasture, free range pastured, and they picked at the grasses and everything else, ate bugs. They ate a very dynamic diet. These are orange, dark yellow yolks. It's from a hen that has a diet that is made up of yellow and orange plant material, alfalfa meal, and yellow corn. Many egg factories take this route. While it might give them a nice golden color, they don't have the same nutrient value. Okay, so now let's throw in essential fatty acids. These are, let's go to egg yolk. So this is your grocery store egg yolk that has mostly omega-6 because of the alfalfa and the soy and the corn meal that they're given. They don't go out and have the bugs and the grass seeds and so on and so forth. So they have a terrible ratio of 16:1. However, if you have pastured free-range egg yolks, the ones that are the orange, the dark orange, those are 1:1. Big deal. So this is the reference you say of just, this is from Chronometer, again, comparing pastured eggs. There's a 19:1 ratio in favor of omega-3, and the other is a 4:1 ratio. So this is absolute brain food. When you put, and this is egg yolk crepes or egg yolk waffles that we make, Judi makes, roll them up, you can just feel the voltage of the choline just open your eyes and your mind. It's an amazing experience. I hope you learn to like liver and do it this way. And this is a little topping here is called jalapeno jelly that we make. Doesn't have any sugar in it, a little bit of stevia and or xylitol just to give it a bit of sweetness there, but it is remarkable. Love it. So what you need to do for yourself right now is to make sure you're getting enough choline, folate, and B12 second. That's what you got to do. That's how you maintain a healthy methylation pattern. And for those of you who really want to go in deep into the epigenetics and reverse aging, we're going to look into this particular study, but I did this at much greater detail in a whole nother video that I'll put up here. And get your genomic testing done. It's not a big expense anymore. But wait, what's the connection with epigenetic reverse aging? We're getting to that. Here's a study I went over. It was done last April, and it's a potential reversal of epigenetic age using diet. So what do? Briefly, I broke it down to what they required their men to have, 18 men, and they had nearly an egg and a half a day, 40 grams of liver, 6 ounces of animal protein. So we did in 6 ounces of a turkey burger that we make at home. And they also recommended certain veggies and so on. So I put all this together. Long story short, all the details are in the other video. So we're looking over here for what they call methyl donors. Methyl donors are certainly the folate, the choline, and the B12. This three are the big three. After that, it's B6 and B2. But these are methyl donors. And that's what they had as a diet. They gave them basically liver, an egg yolk, and some veggies to make sure they had complete source of methyl donors. And then they also said pastured, free-range pastured eggs, so you had a great ratio, okay, of omega-3. All right, what were the results? Here we go. The average was 2 years younger of the 18. 8 scored age reduction, 9 were unchanged, and 1 increased in methylation age, right here, increased by 10 years. So the questions you have to ask is, how did this affect their methylation pattern? Methylation clock is measuring all your genes that are turned on, not methylated, and all your genes that are turned off that are methylated, and it compares it to the populations they've tested, which are thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So they have a very specific, you are about this age, given all the people. It's age and gender for the most part, and maybe region of the world, but it's age and gender. So they're measuring the genes that are methylated. Okay, pretty cool. That's how you talk about it. So at the end of this particular experiment, they measured the before and after. They found, well, actually, there was more genes that were turned on that were supposed to be on, and more genes that were turned off that were supposed to be off. Their methylation pattern got better. Okay, methylation pattern got better because they had a diet of methyl donors, but they filled in the deficiencies that these people had. So the questions that I have that remain for me from this is like, what was their diet like prior to starting? And were they all deficient except for that one guy? Maybe that one guy had no mutations that were a problem, and he had a very healthy lifestyle. So giving him more healthy food didn't make him healthier. You get healthy, you don't necessarily get healthier if you're already doing well. And second, what was their genome analysis? I don't know about this, they do. What mutations did they have that could have influenced their specific results? You know, there is a symptom called overmethylation. So this could happen to that one guy. He was doing fine, and now he's giving more of all the stuff. And so to get overmethylated is not necessarily a good thing. You need to have enough. You don't need to have more. You can't bank this. So the analogy to a bank account, you'll have 4 times the amount of choline that you need on a daily basis, won't work. I hope that was a breath of fresh air, and you're going to go out and get your choline and go out and get your genetic analysis. I just want to add, if these short, sweet topics are something that you're interested in and you want to see more videos just like them, certainly let me know, but also follow these videos. Bye-bye.